This might have been the craziest weekend of regionals in the RLCS so far this season, and y'all see how long this video is, so we're not going to waste any time. In Group A, we had Karmine Corp, German Amigos, SUH, and Solary. And if you're paying close attention, then you might realize that Group A in this event looks very similar to Group A in the last European event, the Winter Cup, because there Group A was Karmine Corp, G1, SUH, and Solary. So with the lone exception of German Amigos, every team in this group faced each other for the second straight time in the group stage. And this wasn't the only group where this happened, because we saw the exact same scenario play out in Group B and Group C, which brings me to my only real complaint about the RLCS format. The way that the teams are grouped up are really static, with the same seeds facing off against each other every single time. And with that being the case, we're bound to see a lot of repeat matches, like we did here. And it's likely that this continues into the spring split too, where the matchups matter a lot more, with the format changing to a straight up double elim tournament. It would be pretty nice if we had a system similar to the Champions League, where instead of seeing the same teams matched up against each other every time, we get our matchups drawn out of seeding pools, so there can be a little bit more variety in the matchups that we see. But alright, no more complaining, because even if we did see a lot of repeat matches, they were just as entertaining. German Amigos came into this final event in 5th place during the winter split, and they were just trying to hang on to their major spot. But they got a scare when they went up against SUH in round 1, where we saw that series go all the way into Game 5, including 3 straight overtimes in Games 2, 3, and 4. But this flip reset from Tox in Game 5 was all the scoring they needed to win that final game and secure the series. But while German Amigos had their hands full, it looked like K-Corp was having a much easier time against Solary. Because while Solary was putting up a fight, K-Corp still won the first 2 games by a score of 3-2. But then Solary bounced back and got the next 2 game wins to send the series all the way to Game 5. And in that last game, Solary were the ones that took control, and they scored the first 3 goals of that game to go on to win 3-1 and get the reverse sweep over K-Corp. Solary may not be getting too many good finishes in tournaments, but they have quietly put together some really good wins against some really good teams, and this one has to be the best of the bunch. And for Solary, the only thing that would have been better than 1 big win was 2 big wins in a row, and they had the chance to get that when they went up against German Amigos in round 2. Just like they did against K-Corp, they put up a really tough fight in the first 2 games of the series, with both of them going to overtime, and each team was able to take one of those wins. But at that point, German Amigos pulled away with the series and they won the next 2 games, getting the series win 3-1. In the other round 2 match, K-Corp was looking to bounce back from their loss to Solary and get a win over SUH. But it wasn't going to be that easy, because SUH was putting up a fight against them too, and that series also went all the way to Game 5. And to make it even more stressful, that Game 5 went into an overtime, meaning that K-Corp were 1 goal away from an 0-2 start to the tournament, and then they would need to face German Amigos. But thanks to this little chip shot from Exotic in that Game 5 overtime, K-Corp avoided that fate, and they got the series win over SUH. And these results seem to set up a really exciting round 3 for this group. First, we had Solary going against SUH. Both of these teams put up really good fights against the top 2 seeds in the group, and Solary even got a win over K-Corp. If SUH lost, then they'd be out of the tournament, and if Solary lost, then their fate would be out of their hands. So after how good both of these teams looked in their first 2 games, this series was setting up to be a really good one. But instead, SUH got the 3-0 sweep. And if it wasn't for 1 goal that Solary scored in Game 1 of that series, it would have been a perfect sweep. They outscored them 9-1 in all 3 games, and this series was never really close. So that might have been a bit anticlimactic. But for the other round 3 matchup, we had K-Corp going against German Amigos. K-Corp really struggled with 2 teams they were heavily favored against, so it seemed like they weren't in top form. And while German Amigos also had their work cut out for them against the other 2 teams, at least they managed to walk out with wins both times. And they even looked really in control in the last 2 games against Solary. So if there was a time for German Amigos to finally beat K-Corp, this was going to be that time. But just like the other round 3 match in this group, we saw another 3-0 sweep, this time for K-Corp. The first 2 games were really close, including a Game 2 that went to overtime. But after K-Corp scored in that overtime to take the game win, German Amigos kind of fell apart in Game 3 and lost that one 4-1. So after the first 2 rounds in this group were really exciting, we kind of got 2 duds at the end. So when this group was all said and done, K-Corp and German Amigos were both 2-1, but since K-Corp had the head-to-head win, they took the tiebreaker. And both SUH and Solary had a 1-2 record. But since SUH got the win when those 2 teams played, they had the tiebreaker over Solary. So even though Solary got the win over K-Corp in this group, the final standings ended up being K-Corp first, German Amigos second, SUH third, and Solary last. In Group B, we had Moist, G1, Team BDS, and Tundra, which was the same as Group B in the last event, except this time, we brought in G1 in Quadrant's place. Heading into this event, every team in this group was on the outside looking in for major qualification. Moist and G1 were right on the edge, Team BDS had some work to do, and Tundra had a lot of work to do. But any one of these teams would have been very excited about winning this group and going straight into the quarterfinals. Moist and Tundra played each other pretty close because their first 2 games went to overtime, but Moist got both wins and went on to win the series in 4 games. And the other match saw G1 going against BDS. BDS got the fast start in that series, taking the Game 1 win, but then G1 got the next 3 wins in the series, including a Game 4 overtime, where Atomic stole Monkey Moon's inaccurate pass and shot the ball into an open net. Next, G1 faced off against Tundra, and in G1's case, they pretty much played the exact same series 2 times in a row. They lost Game 1 to Tundra, but then they went on to win the next 3 games and took the series in 4. And on the other side of round 2, BDS did the exact same thing. Moist took Game 1, and then BDS won the next 3, including 2 overtime wins in Game 3 and 4. And with that, BDS got a 3-1 victory. So heading into round 3, G1 just needed 1 more victory to get a 3-0 start and secure first place in their group. But they would need to get that win over a very hungry Moist team. But after a pretty tight series where every game was decided by just 1 goal, G1 got the series win, again winning the series in 4 games. Going 3-0 in this group gave G1 yet another good group stage showing, and Atomic especially looked like he was once again in top form. But all split, the biggest issue for G1 was getting a win in the playoffs. And after going directly into the quarterfinals, they would get one last chance to do that. But in the other round 3 matchup, BDS had a lot of pressure. They won the first 2 games of the series, and then they dropped Game 3. So all they had to do was win Game 4 to ensure that every series in this group was won in exactly 4 games. But Tundra spoiled this rare feat by winning Game 4 and taking the series all the way to a Game 5, which ended up being a Game 5 that BDS won comfortably by a score of 4-1. So after every other series in this group went to 4 games, the very last one finally gave us a different result and went all the way to 5. But unfortunately for Tundra, this result meant that they would once again be knocked out in the group stage. So just like Solary in Group A, Tundra was eliminated in the group stage in all 3 winter events. So the final standings in this group was G1 first, Team BDS second, Moist third, and Tundra last. In Group C, we had Team Liquid, Team Vitality, Williams Resolve, and Foo Fact Stop. And this Group C was the exact same as the Group C from last event, except we subbed out Much Delight and subbed in Foo Fact Stop. And this also brings me into one more complaint that I have about the format, and then I swear I'm done. Both Foo Fact Stop and Monaco Esports in Group D played in this event despite not qualifying for either one of the other 2 regionals in the split. And they played because the qualifier to get into this event was to be in the top 16 for overall points throughout the entire season. And since these 2 teams did well in the fall split, that was enough to qualify them for the last event of the winter, which I also don't really like. If you're gonna have a winter invitational, then I think that should be reserved for the best teams of the winter. Like, what if a team qualified for the spring major because of how many points they got in the first 2 splits? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and I think that the invitational should kind of be treated the same way. I know that example with the major is kind of extreme and wouldn't actually happen, but it still feels really similar. But yeah, I don't know, just my 2 cents. Anyways, getting into the actual games, in the first round we had Team Liquid going up against Foo Fact Stop, and they got a very comfortable win where they showed off all of their offensive ability, because in the 3-game sweep, they averaged over 4 goals a game. The other round 1 matchup was Vitality against Resolve, with Vitality looking to avenge their upset loss from the last event, and they got that revenge by beating Resolve in a 3-0 sweep, and outscoring them 8 goals to 2. So round 1 for the top 2 seeds in this group went pretty smoothly, but round 2 would be anything but. Liquid went up against Resolve, and after 2 overtime wins, Resolve put themselves in match point and put Liquid in the spot where they would have to reverse sweep to win the series. And Game 4 got really stressful for Liquid because we saw that go to an overtime that lasted almost 5 minutes. But Liquid pulled out the win in that game, and they also got the win in the decisive Game 5 to win the series and start off their group 2-0. And Vitality saw themselves in a match that was just as stressful because their series to Foo Fact Stop was also going into Game 5. And in Vitality's case, that Game 5 also went into an overtime. But unlike Liquid, Vitality didn't get the happy ending because Parker got the final goal in that overtime, giving Foo Fact Stop the huge upset victory. And Foo Fact Stop wasn't done yet because in their final series against Resolve, they went into another Game 5, even after Resolve started off that series really hot with an 8-1 victory. And for the second straight Game 5, they iced up and got another really big win. So even with all the complaining that I just did, saying how I didn't think they should have been in this event in the first place, I gotta admit that they made the best of this opportunity, and they definitely looked like they were good enough to be here. But on the other hand, after a really strong showing from Resolve in the last event, they're now getting kicked out in the group stage in this event. And I'm sure that they were hoping to build on their last performance, so I'm sure that this is a pretty serious letdown for them. But at the same time, they still had some bright spots. After all, taking a team like Liquid to 5 games is not easy to do. So even with this tough finish to the winter, Resolve definitely has to be one of the teams to watch for the spring. And to round out this group, we had Team Liquid going against Team Vitality. Vitality got off to a hot start, winning the first 2 games, which meant that for the second series in a row, if Team Liquid wanted to win, they would need to get a reverse sweep. And they immediately showed that they were up to that task by scoring 2 goals in the first minute of Game 3, while going on to win that Game 3, and also winning the rest of the games in the series, because they pulled off another reverse sweep. Getting back-to-back reverse sweeps against Resolve and Team Vitality is a very tall order, but they were able to do it both times. And to make these wins even better, after placing first in their group, Team Liquid officially clinched their spot at the Winter Major, becoming the 3rd team to do so after Karmine Corp and the team that I'll talk about in a little bit. But the final standings for Group C was Team Liquid first, Fufax Dop second, Team Vitality third, and Williams Resolve last. Rounding out the group stage, we had Oxygen, Quadrant, Sonics, and Monaco Esports. And this was the only group in the event that didn't have at least 3 of the same teams from the previous event, although they did still have 2, with Oxygen and Sonics both being in Group D 2 times in a row. In round 1, we saw Oxygen going against Monaco. And before the event, we learned that Oxygen was going to be a little short-handed, because Rise was playing this event with a broken wrist. Oxygen does have a sub, so if Rise wanted to sit out, then they'd be able to sub somebody in. But the fact that he was able to play through it was pretty encouraging for them. But that didn't make their series any less nerve-wracking, because Monaco took them all the way to a Game 5. But Oxygen came up clutch and got the 3-0 win in that Game 5 to take the series. The other round 1 match was Quadrant going up against Sonics, and we saw Sonics head into the series shorthanded too, but they were shorthanded for a very different reason. For the first 2 games, their coach Andy the Mandy had to sub in for Arju, and he later tweeted out that he wasn't able to play in those first 2 games because he was stuck outside of his house. So yeah, of course, Sonics lost those first 2 games. And when Arju came back, Sonics looked like the team they were supposed to be, and they took the Game 3 victory after a 7-second overtime. But then in Game 4, Quadrant bounced back with their own overtime victory after 6 seconds, which gave them the series win in 4 games, which is really good for them because I wouldn't want to be the team that lost to the team that was using their coach. But yeah, Quadrant's way too good for that, and they got the job done. And Quadrant also got the job done again in the next round when they went up against Monaco, because they won that series in 4 games as well. And on the other side of round 2, Oxygen showed that Rise's wrist wasn't going to be too much of a problem, and they got a very confident looking 3-0 sweep over Sonics. But as we went into round 3 of this group, the major implications started to be a big factor. Sonics were only a few points out of the race, and there was a chance for them to put themselves in the conversation if they got enough wins in the playoffs. But before they could think that far ahead, they had to make it to the playoffs, and after an 0-2 start in the group, a loss to Monaco knocked them out. But Monaco were the ones to get momentum first in the series by getting a 5-2 win in Game 1. And after Sonics just managed to claw out an overtime win in Game 2, Monaco found their momentum from Game 1 again and went on to win Game 3 and Game 4 to take the series and knock Sonics out of the tournament. I mentioned in my last video that Cash had a really bad streak of finishes in the 3rd regional of each split. But one thing that I didn't mention was that since Cash had a bad streak of regional 3s, that meant Arju and Matane also had a bad streak of regional 3s. And it looks like this time, they were the ones to fall victim to it. Because after a 2-0 start in their group, Cash and Quadrant were doing just fine. But they had a much tougher challenge in front of them now, going up against Oxygen. Coming into this tournament, Quadrant was just 1 spot outside of the top 5. So winning this group to make it straight into the quarterfinals and get those extra points automatically would be a huge boost for them. But Oxygen didn't even come close to letting that happen, because they beat Quadrant in a 3-0 sweep. This win gave them first place in the group, and it also locked in their spot at the Winter Major, becoming the 2nd team to do so since their match finished up just before Team Liquid's. And the final standings in this group was Oxygen first, Quadrant second, Monaco Esports third, and Sonics last. Now as we head out of the group stage and into round 1, we had these 4 matchups. First, let's look at BDS versus Monaco. Of course, BDS have been having a really rough season so far, but their winter split's been even tougher than their fall, because in the first 2 tournaments, they weren't able to make it to the top 8 once. So if they're going to finally break into the top 8, they're going to have to beat Monaco. And fortunately for them, they pulled that off by getting a 3-0 sweep. And this series was kind of an offensive shootout. BDS scored 13 goals over the 3 games, and Monaco scored 8. So there were a lot of goals going in on both sides, but of course BDS scored more, and they won the series because of that, knocking out Monaco in the process. But while we're talking about Monaco, I have to bring up Stizzy for a second, because this guy is cold, and he honestly has been for a while. He led his team in goals, assists, and saves during this event, had the highest shooting percentage out of anybody, and was 2nd out of everybody in average score per game. He made his impact felt everywhere on the field, and he did it while positioning himself more conservatively than you would probably expect. So he reminds me a lot of Atomic in that regard. And I mean the Atomic that plays for G1, not the one that plays for G2. So yeah, Stizzy is the real deal, and keep your eye on him moving forward. Next we had Fufax playing against Suh. Hardly anybody expected either one of these teams to make it to the top 8, but now one of them would be there. Fufax got the first 2 wins in the series, and then Suh got the next 2 wins in the series to bring us to another Game 5 for Fufax, making it 3 series in a row for them that would go the distance. And again for the 3rd time in a row, Fufax won that Game 5, moving on in the tournament and making it to the top 8. But this also has to be a tough loss for Suh, because for the 2nd straight tournament, they were knocked out after being 1 game away from making it to the top 8. And while I know that has to be pretty tough for them, I hope that they're still proud of how they played, because they show that they're a team that nobody can sleep on. But now, as we head into the other 2 matches in round 1, this is when we start getting the real major implications. Team Vitality went up against German Amigos, in a matchup of 2 teams who were already top 5 in points before the event started, but now one of them would be knocked out early and would have their fate out of their hands. A Vitality win would clinch their spot at the major, and a win for German Amigos would put them 1 point behind Vitality and give them even more breathing room against all the other teams who were trying to catch up to them. Every game in this series was really tight, with each game being decided by 1 goal, and 2 of them going into overtime, but Vitality came out on top in all 3 matches. So even after a hard-fought series from German Amigos, they still got swept and got eliminated from the tournament, putting their fate for the major in other teams' hands. But with this win, Team Vitality officially clinched their spot at the Winter Major, being the 4th team to do so, and leaving only 1 more major spot for all the other teams to fight for. And one of those teams would be quickly knocked out of that fight, because in the next series, we had Quadrant versus Moist. These teams were 6th and 7th in points heading into this event, but now with a loss here, one of them would be eliminated. Moist got out ahead first in the series, winning the first 2 games by a score of 2-1 and 3-0. But then Quadrant got the momentum back on their side with a 5-0 win in Game 3, and then a 1-0 win in Game 4, meaning that we would go into a Game 5, and there would only be 1 game to decide who would have their major hopes continue, and which team would have those hopes taken away right here. Moist jumped out ahead first by going up 2-1 in this game, but then after this perfect drop-down pass from Cash to Ixo, Quadrant tied the game up, and they didn't look back from there. They scored the next 3 goals in that game to win this game by a score of 5-2 and keep their major hopes alive, while putting an end to Moist with a reverse sweep. And now with the points that they got from this win, Quadrant was now tied with German Amigos for that last major spot. This was an awesome series, and it really felt like both of these teams deserved to be in the top 8. I've already given my thoughts about Moist in my video after the Winter Cup, but I'll just say again here that I'm excited for this team in the spring split, because I still do think that they'll improve with more time together, and I bet the spring split is where we start to see that play out. So now going into the quarterfinals, we had these 4 matchups, and the first match of the day was Team Liquid against Quadrant. A win for Quadrant would break the tie with German Amigos and would give them sole possession of the major spot for the time being. Team Liquid, on the other hand, had already clinched their major spot, but even without major implications, you know that they still wanted to go really far in this tournament. Plus, this was a matchup that Team Liquid had recently dominated, because after Quadrant won the first time that these teams matched up, Team Liquid had won 4 straight series against Quadrant, with 3 of those series wins being a sweep for Liquid. And Quadrant didn't get off to a great start of breaking that trend, because 7 seconds into Game 1, Team Liquid already scored their first goal. But Quadrant bounced back to score the next 2 goals in that game, and got the Game 1 win over Liquid by a score of 2-1. And after that good start for Quadrant, the series was going back and forth the entire way. We saw a Game 5 overtime with the teams tied at 2 games apiece, where Liquid got the win after a great double tap pass from Atto down to Oski in front of the goal, who finished off the play. Then we saw a Game 6 overtime where Relating Wave won a challenge with a flip reset, then used that flip reset to win a second challenge to center the ball for Ixo, who slotted the shot into the top right corner. This whole series was full of great plays for both teams, but now we would only have 1 more game to decide the winner. And Game 7 was really tight between these teams too, because after 3 minutes of play, the score was still tied at 0-0. But then after Liquid scored their first goal, they completely ran away with it. Liquid scored 5 goals over the final 2 minutes of that game, and won that Game 7 by a score of 5-0, and made sure that Quadrant was stuck at the top with German Amigos. But the next quarterfinal saw another team who was looking to join that tie with Quadrant and German Amigos, because if G1 was able to beat Vitality in their quarterfinal matchup, then they would gain 4 points, and we would have a 3-way tie for the 5th major spot. And it should be said that Team Vitality was also the team to knock out G1 of the playoffs in the last event before the top 8. So getting some revenge here, on top of tying themselves for the major spot, would have made the win feel even better. But G1 hadn't gotten a single playoff win yet this split, and they weren't on the right track to getting one here either, because Vitality took Game 1 by a score of 4-1. But after that first loss, G1 stepped up their level of play and won the next 4 games to take this series 4-1. And this win was huge for G1 for multiple reasons. First of all, they finally got their first win in the playoffs during the winter split, and with how good this team has looked at times during the winter, it honestly felt like they're overdue for that. But it's also important because now they were officially tied with German Amigos and Quadrant for the 5th spot of the major. And if they won their match in the semifinals against Team Liquid, then they would have that 5th spot all to themselves. So out of the 3 teams that were tied for the major, they were the only ones that still had their fate in their own hands. Now going on to the next quarterfinal match, this was the only one that had no major implications, because Oxygen was already in and Fufaxdap had no chance of getting in. But you can still be sure that Fufaxdap were set on continuing their really good tournament with another upset win. And to win here against Oxygen would have been easily their most impressive one of the entire tournament. So how would Fufaxdap do on their quest for another upset? Well, they wouldn't do very well, because Oxygen was just way too good and they won the series with a 4-0 sweep. To their credit, Fufaxdap did play them really closely in a lot of the games, because 3 of the games were only decided by 1 goal. But again, Oxygen is just on another level. But making it all the way to the top 8 is still a huge showing for this team. And the last quarterfinal match we had was K-Corp going up against Team BDS. BDS still wasn't out of the major picture, because now that German Amigos and Quadrant were eliminated, if BDS won the entire tournament, then they would sneak into the 5th place spot and clinch their place in the major. But in order to do that, they would need to get through K-Corp, which is always easier said than done. But BDS showed that they would at least be able to put up a fight when they took K-Corp to overtime in Game 1. But K-Corp were the ones to score in that overtime, giving themselves the 1-0 lead in the series. Then after K-Corp went on to win Game 2, BDS had one more chance to make the series competitive, because if they went down 3-0 to K-Corp, then the series might as well have already been lost, because I don't think anybody would count on K-Corp being reverse swept in a best of 7. In that pivotal Game 3, BDS took K-Corp to another overtime, but in that overtime, we see Extra be just a little too slow to a challenge from the 3rd man spot, and he gets beat by Exotic, leaving their own goal open for Exotic to finish the easy shot. And from there, that was pretty much it. BDS did manage to get a win in Game 4, but K-Corp won Game 5 to win the series and knock BDS out of the tournament and out of major contention. And now that BDS haven't been able to get back into form all season, it's looking more and more certain that they won't be at the World Championship. As it currently stands, Europe will have 7 spots at Worlds, and BDS is currently in 9th place. So at this rate, BDS will have to make it to the Spring Major, and they'll have to do well at the Spring Major in order to make up the points difference to give themselves a chance of making Worlds. And with how they've looked so far this season, it's hard to be too confident in that happening. Now we head into Championship Sunday, and we start with the single most important series that we've seen when it comes to making it to the Winter Major. G1 was going up against Team Liquid, and the major hopes of G1, Quadrant, and German Amigos were all hanging on this match. If G1 got the win, then they would secure their spot in the Winter Major. But if they lost, then we would have a 3-team tiebreaker to determine who gets that last spot. And just like pretty much every other series that Liquid played in this tournament, this match was really close. The teams went back and forth trading wins between Game 1 and 4, and went into Game 5 with the series tied at 2 games apiece. But then G1 broke that alternating trend by winning their 2nd game in a row in Game 5 to go up 3-2 in the series, going to match point and major qualification point. But Team Liquid got the Game 6 win to get into another Game 7, so for the 4th series in a row for them, they went all the way to the final game. And that last game was just as close as the entire series. With just over a minute to play, they were tied at 2-2. But then after we see Mark by 8 deflect the ball into his own net that probably could have been saved by Dorito, Team Liquid got a lead that they would hold on to for the rest of the game, and they hung on to get yet another clutch series win to go all the way into the grand finals. And now G1, German Amigos, and Quadrant were officially locked into a 3-way tiebreaker to see who would be going into the major. But as far as the actual regional, it was really good to see G1 finally show their quality in the playoffs when it mattered most. And this was especially true for Atomic, because he's been looking good individually all split, but this might have been his best performance yet. He was 2nd in Octane rating per game, 1st in average score per game, 1st in saves, and in the top 10 for both goals and assists for the entire event. So he was everywhere and he was doing everything. Atomic has honestly been one of the best players in Europe all season, and it was nice to see him show that off on this big of a stage. So before we can get back to worrying about the major, we have to finish out this regional. And the next match was the other semifinal, which featured K-Corp and Oxygen. And this semifinal wasn't quite as close as the other one. Karmine Corp won the first 2 games in a shutout before Oxygen used their timeout to regroup. Then they bounced back to get a decisive win in Game 3 before playing K-Corp really closely again in Game 4, sending that game into overtime. But 32 seconds into OT, we see Itachi go the length of the field with the ball by himself to score the game-winning goal and give K-Corp a 3-1 series lead. They were looking just as good as they had been all split, and when they're in form like that, coming back from 3-1 might as well be impossible. And sure enough, K-Corp closed out the series with a 5-2 win in Game 5, locking in their spot in the Grand Finals and setting up a rematch of the Winter Cup Grand Finals with K-Corp facing off against Team Liquid again. K-Corp beat Team BDS and Oxygen in 5 games, and never looked too threatened in either of those series, so they looked to be in the same form that they had been in all season, that being the best team in the region. Meanwhile, Team Liquid barely scraped into these playoffs, going to 7 games against Team Liquid and G1. So with those two things in mind, K-Corp was a heavy favorite to win the series and go 3 for 3 in regional wins throughout the winter split, which would be a first in the RLCS for Europe or North America. But as the series got going, Team Liquid showed that they weren't going down without a fight. K-Corp and Team Liquid traded victories between games 1 and 4, and all of those games were decided by just 1 goal. But in game 5, it was Team Liquid who broke the streak of 1-goal victories, as they got a 3-0 victory in that game and advanced to match point. But in the game 6 overtime, we see Exotic slowly work his way down the field, getting past Acronic and Atto to score the goal for K-Corp. And this meant that for the first time all season in Europe, we would have a grand finals that went all the way to game 7. And as you would expect, that game 7 also went down to the wire. But with the teams tied at 1-1 with just under a minute left to play, we see Atto getting the ball with a lot of space to play with, since Exotic and Vatira are taking wide rotations back to their goal on 0 boost. And then we see Atto do what he does best, and he throws a perfect pass right over to Oski, right before Exotic can close the distance on the challenge. Then Oski sends a perfect shot right under the crossbar to get the ball past Vatira and into the goal, giving Team Liquid a lead that they would hold on to for the rest of the game. So Team Liquid get the regional win over Carmine Corp, and they now have their second regional win, with both of the wins coming in the third regional of each split. So, of course, watch out for these guys in the Spring Invitational. And usually, this would be the point where we move on to the other regions. But we weren't quite done with Europe yet, because now it was time to play the tiebreakers. So German Amigos, G1, and Quadrant had to duke it out to see who would be the last team to go to San Diego for Europe. And the teams were seeded by overall points for the season. So since Quadrant had the most points overall, that meant that G1 and German Amigos had to play each other first, and then the winner of that match would play Quadrant, and then the winner of that match would be going to the major. So getting into G1 versus German Amigos, that series looked a lot like so many other series that we had seen out of Europe this weekend, and it was really close the entire way. The teams traded victories back and forth up to game 4, and we went into game 5 with the series tied at 2-2. And Amigos got off to a fast start in that game 5 by scoring the first goal in 5 seconds. But G1 bounced back from that to score the game's other 2 goals and go up 3-2 in the series. And now in game 6, G1 was the team that scored 5 seconds in. And unlike German Amigos, they wouldn't let that lead go. They went on to win that final game 4-1 and got a hat-trick from Dorito in the process. So now, G1 was getting ready to play their third series of the day. And this match against Quadrant was their last chance to qualify for the Winter Major. But Quadrant was not a team that was going to go down easy. Because even though they had already made it to the Fall Major, and they consistently get good results in the European Regionals, a lot of people in the community are still huge doubters of this team. So making it to 2 majors in a row would be a great way to silence all of those doubters. And as I'm sure you probably expected by this point, this series was also really close and really entertaining. It started off with a G1 win in game 1, then we saw 2 straight Quadrant wins in game 2 and game 3. So now they had the momentum, and another win from Quadrant would have meant a 3-1 hole that G1 would have to dig their way out of. But G1 fought back and got their own win in game 4. So now we have yet another series that's tied going into game 5. And that next game was an absolute banger. Everybody on the field looked like they were deserving of a major spot, but after a while, this game 5 kind of turned into the Dorito versus Relating Wave show, because those two were on another level. They were both involved in every single goal for their team, and they both kept making great play after great play. But only one of them could make the play that would go on to win the game. And after Atomic passes the ball infield to Dorito, he snipes it under the crossbar to get the game-winning goal, and put G1 on major qualification point. But of course, Quadrant had no interest in going out like that, and they scored the first 3 goals in game 6. But the only problem with the goals that Quadrant scored was that they scored them in just over a minute of game time, which meant that G1 had a lot of time to come back. And after Dorito scored this goal, after Cash was demoed by Mark by 8, that's exactly what they did. And after giving up 3 straight goals at the beginning of the game, G1 fought all the way back, and they were able to force this game to go into overtime too. And then in that overtime, we see G1 somehow manage to pull off a 3-man passing play from the offensive corner, with Mark by 8 passing the ball down to Dorito, and then Dorito hitting the ball off the back wall twice to send it back to Atomic, who slots in the low angle shot to give G1 the series win in the final spot of the major. This was an insane series between 2 really good teams, and in my opinion they both look like teams who are worthy of being at the major, but unfortunately only one of them can go. And this time around it ended up being G1. Having an awesome series like this was a great way to finish off the weekend for Europe, because the Winter Invitational was honestly one of the best regionals I had seen in a very long time. and the fact that there's so much on the line in terms of making it to the major just made it that much better. But the best part is that all the other regions were extremely entertaining in their own right. Now as we take a look at South America, heading into their third regional, their scenarios for the major might have been even crazier than what we saw in Europe. They only had 2 spots available, but heading into this event, there are 3 different teams who were tied for first in points. Those 3 teams being Secret, Crew Esports, and Exceed. So this event would basically decide who would be the one knocked out. But things got interesting really early in South America, because out of those 3 teams that are tied for first place, only one of them won their group. Team Secret won Group A, but Crew Esports lost Group B to the club, and Exceed lost Group C to NIP. And for good measure, W7M, who I consider to be another one of the top teams in the region, also came second in their group when they fell to Parabellum Esports. All of these upsets were really cool for a bunch of different reasons. In the club's case, they finally got a really big win over one of the region's top teams after coming really close to that big win all split. And in NIP's case, it showed that they can still be one of the top teams in the region, even if a couple of quarterfinal losses in the other 2 tournaments have taken them out of major contention. But the craziest thing about these upsets is that it now meant that Crew Esports and Team Secret were now going to meet up against each other in the quarterfinals. The winner of that match would have their spot at the major locked in, and the loser would have their fate out of their hands, because if Exceed won their quarterfinal match, then they would also be locked into the major. But before we got to those matches, the first quarterfinal we saw was NIP going up against W7M. This pitted the 2 best teams that weren't a part of the major conversation against each other. And the series didn't disappoint because it went all the way to Game 7, and we saw 4 overtimes played in this series, including an overtime in Game 7. And in that overtime, we saw the Great One score a solo goal after dropping down from the ceiling and shooting the ball after Astromic blew up Wisty in net. But after that, we moved on to the biggest quarterfinal match, with Secret facing off against Crew with everything on the line. Team Secret got the first 2 wins in pretty close games, but Crew was able to swing back the momentum on their side with a 3-0 victory in Game 3. But unfortunately for them, the momentum didn't last too long, because Secret swung back and got a 4-1 victory in Game 4, taking a 3-1 lead in the series and having triple match point. Crew was able to hold them off for one more game with a Game 5 win, but then Team Secret locked in one more time on defense and got a 3-0 shutout win in Game 6 to win that series 4-2 and lock in their spot at the Winter Major. With this loss, Crew had no more chances to earn points, and they were still tied with Exceed. So if Exceed won their match against Parabellum Esports, then they'll clinch their own spot at the major and knock out Crew in the process. But things got off to a fun start when Parabellum won Game 1 of that series, and they showed that they weren't going down easy. Exceed bounced back to win Game 2, but then Game 3 marked the beginning of the end of this series, because after that point, one team was in control for the rest of the way, because Parabellum won Game 3 by a score of 2-1, then they won Game 4 by a score of 2-1, and then they won Game 5, again, by a score of 2-1. So Parabellum got the huge upset win over Exceed in the quarterfinals, and that meant we would be getting a tiebreaker match between Crew and Exceed to see who would be joining Team Secret as South America's other team at the Winter Major. The last quarterfinal match was the club going up against Final Form. The club was the favorite since they beat Crew to win their group, but Final Form had a real chance at an upset since they took NIP and Exceed to 5 games when they played them in the group stage. But the club shut down the upset bid emphatically with a 4-0 sweep and 4 hard-fought games. But just like how the club shut down Final Form's upset bid, NIP shut down the club's upset bid in the semifinals, because in that series, NIP got a 4-0 sweep of their own. Even though NIP hasn't quite had the split that everybody expected out of them, I think they still have to be seen as one of the best teams in the region. And if just a couple different things went another way earlier in the split, then NIP probably could have had a really good shot of making it to the major. In the first regional, they got matched up with Exceed in the quarterfinals, and after a really tight series that went all the way to 7 games, NIP fell just short of getting the win. Then in the second regional, they got matched up with Team Secret in the quarterfinals, and they again lost a really close and really hard-fought series that went all the way to Game 7 again. If they were able to muster out just one more goal in those series, or even if they had just gotten a different matchup in those quarterfinals, then we'd be looking at NIP split in a completely different light. But unfortunately for them, it just didn't work out that way this time. But at the very least, I'm really happy about the fact that this team was able to validate their talent by making it all the way to the grand finals in this tournament, even if they didn't have a chance of making it to the major. As far as who they'd be going up against in that grand finals, that would be determined by the other semifinal match, where we saw Team Secret going up against Parabellum. And after Parabellum jumped out to a 2-1 lead in games heading into Game 4, it looked like we might have had another upset brewing. And the upset looked even more likely after Parabellum jumped out to a 2-goal lead in that Game 4. But Team Secret bounced back to score the next 2 goals and bring us into an overtime. And then we see KV1 drop in a super accurate shot all the way to the right side of the net to give Team Secret the game win. And while the next 2 games in the series were also really hard fought, Team Secret came out on top in both of them to move on to the grand finals and set up a date with NIP. These were the two teams that almost everybody expected to make it to the major out of this region. And while that didn't come to pass this time, we at least got the chance to see these two teams square off in the grand finals of the final regional in the split. And this series didn't disappoint at all. Team Secret jumped out to a 2-1 lead heading into Game 4, and then that Game 4 went into an overtime that lasted for almost 8 minutes before Kyle passed the ball off the ceiling infield to Bems, who knocked home the shot and secured the game win for Nip. Then after Team Secret came back to win Game 5 and go up 3-2 in the series, Game 6 went into another long overtime, this one going for almost 4 minutes before we see Astramic getting that game-winning goal. Every time it looked like Team Secret had Nip on the ropes, they would always fight back and make the play that they needed to keep themselves in the series. And after we saw 6 straight really close games, Game 7 was completely different. Because after Team Secret scored the first goal, Nip went on to score 5 unanswered goals, including 3 in the final minute. So Nip got the Game 7 win, and they got the regional win, proving without a doubt that even if they didn't have a chance at the major, they are still one of the best teams in the region. And I think that they also proved that Sam definitely deserves more than 2 spots at the majors. Because between Team Secret, Crew, Nip, and Exceed, and maybe W7M, this region had 4 or 5 teams that all looked like they were worthy of playing at majors. And speaking of playing at majors, after the grand finals, we still had the tiebreaker match between Exceed and Crew to determine who the other team at the major would be. Exceed took the first game of the series after winning in overtime, but then Crew fought back to win Game 2. Then after that, Crew won Game 3 in overtime before Exceed bounced back to win Game 4. And in that Game 5 with the two teams tied at 1-1, we see this 50 from drops go directly into Drufinho's car. And after what honestly might be one of the best 50s I've ever seen, Drufinho hits it into the open net and gives Crew series point. In Game 6, Exceed drew first blood by scoring on an open net after Crew dedicated all their resources into their offensive attack. But Crew quickly bounced back with a goal of their own to knot the game up at 1-1 and send us into a scenario where the next goal is very likely to win the game. And with 4 seconds left in the game, we see drops bump KNS all the way up to the ceiling, which opened up an opportunity for Drufinho, and he took full advantage of it, beating Davitrox to the ball and slotting in the shot that gave Crew the series win and secured their spot at the major. While I do think there are a lot of teams in South America who are worthy of being at the major, I do also think that the 2 major spots are going to the 2 most deserving teams. But with that said, this is still a split to remember for Exceed, because they came in with no expectations, and by the end they were 1 series away from making it to the major. So hats off to Davitrox, Klaus, and KNS, because they deserve all the love in the world. Alright, for the last 2 regions, I'm going to go ahead and skip to the grand finals, because this video is already super long, and my voice is getting tired. So as we get into APAC, the 2 teams we had in the grand finals were Elevate and Gaming Gladiators. And this grand final was pretty much this major's tiebreaker too, because Elevate and Gladiators were both tied for first in the region in points. So whoever won the series would be in first place all by themselves, and they would take APAC's only spot at the Winter Major. Just about everybody expected Elevate to be the team to win the series, and they quickly got off on the right foot, because after Gladiators took Game 1, Elevate won the next 3 games to go up 3-1 in the series. So all it would take is 1 more win for them to make it to the major. But they didn't get that win in Game 5, because after a great challenge from OSM to send the ball infield, LCT was right there to finish off the goal and give Gladiators the Game 5 win. And then Elevate didn't get that win in Game 6 either, because with the score tied at 2, LCT beat a charging Realize to the ball and popped a shot into Elevate's open net to give Gladiators the 2nd straight win and send the series to Game 7. So if Elevate wanted to avoid blowing a 3-1 series lead, they would need to get the win in Game 7. But in fact, they didn't even end up getting a goal in Game 7, because Gladiators won that final game 2-0 and got a huge upset win over Elevate to get the major spot for themselves against all odds. In a weekend that was full of crazy results in every single region, I wouldn't blame you for saying that this was the most unexpected. And honestly, I would have agreed with you if it wasn't for what happened in Sub-Saharan Africa. Because this time, the answer to the question of did Limitless lose was yes. For only the 2nd time all season, Limitless lost the series. And since this time they lost in the grand finals, this was also their first time all season not winning the regional. And the team that they lost to was Nixa, which featured Mr. Low, Arceon, and Skill Steal. And that's the same Skill Steal that this Limitless roster dropped in favor of To Die For. Just like Gladiators in APAC, Nixa had to come back from being down 3-1 to win this regional. And after winning in overtime in both Game 6 and Game 7, they did just that. So even if this Limitless team is still by far the best one in Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm sure it still feels really good for their former teammate to get a regional win off of them. Alright, that's it. We finally made it to the end. So to quote Gotham Chess, get out of here. And to quote Buttery Hotness, thanks for watching.